Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Schools Forum meeting on the 30th of April, 2025. It's wonderful to see you all here. So we're going to go through the agenda bit by bit here. The first item on our agenda is the appointment of the vice chair of the Schools Forum. Do we have any nominations? Yes. So Louise, Troy from the nursery school sector. Anyone else? No. Wonderful. Shall we take a vote on Louise being the vice chair? Unanimous? Incredible. Welcome to the role, Louise, and thank you so much. Apologies and absence. So we've received apologies from Rasheen Walsh, Erin Woolley, Sajada Sajid, Kimberly Herring. I know Susan Dillon is trying to get in. I don't know if she's with us yet, but I know she's attempting to get in. From officers, Robert South, Helen Harding, Emily Hill.
From Charlotte Haynes, head.
Charlotte as well.
And I've got an apology to give from Roisin Wool.
From Roisin. Okay. Are there any others? No? No. Okay. Any urgent matters? None that have been raised with me? Nope. Any matters to be considered in private? Nope. Declarations of interest? Nope. So let's take a look then and review the minutes of the January meeting. We'll go through it as we typically do, just looking at the page numbers that are on the bottom. Any issues with page 3, page 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. On page 9, there is a spelling error, but I've raised that with the clerk already. 10. No. Amazing. Consider those approved. Great. Membership. Changes to membership. So we need to welcome Helen Rye, who is new to the board, replacing John Bailey, who was a Maintain primary school member and is now Maintain special school member. So we welcome Helen and we re-welcome John in his new role. And John is replacing the wonderful and incredible Paul Adair, who has since retired. And left the forum. Any other changes? I don't believe so. No. Okay, well, let's move on to the reports then. So I will be quiet now and I will hand over to Kim.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, let's get to the right page. So just first to set out what the report covers. So the key things for today from the report are seeking approval from the Schools Forum for the Scheme for Financing Schools for 25-26, to provide the forum with an update, brief update on the rollout of the early years extended entitlements, to provide the forum with a brief update on work to maximise schools block and pupil premium funding around free school meals, to provide the forum with an update on the SEND strategy and the DSG management plan, and to update the forum on top-up funding arrangements. So we'll go through the recommendations in turn. So the first recommendations are around the scheme for financing schools. So the draft scheme is attached to the report as Appendix 1, which is pages 25 to 61. So there's 3 recommendations around this. So noting the summary of the changes, agreeing to the revised scheme coming into effect from the 1st of April, So that's a decision for the forum. And then noting if there are any further amendments following feedback, that we'll report and consider these at the next meeting of the forum. So moving to page 14, where the content on this is. So as I say, the scheme is substantially the same as the one approved for 24-25. The DfE published their kind of model scheme at the end of March each year, and that contains any directed revisions and any key updates that we should be incorporating into our scheme. So there were no DfE directive revisions, and there was just one key update. So on page 14, item 3, the key update is around the addition of an extra item where schools' budget share may be charged, where there's an undisputed invoice for energy, where the school's entered into an agreement with the Secretary of State and failed to pay the invoice. So that update has been added into the scheme. The approved scheme will be published on the EGFO in the usual place. The scheme maintains the existing balance control mechanism. So forum members will remember we had a conversation in the November and January meeting about whether we were minded to make any changes for the mechanism included in this scheme, and took the decision that actually we set that to one side for now and revisit it when we can have a look at the balances in the June meeting and decide whether there's something we want to consult on further in the autumn. So the scheme maintains the existing mechanism with just a small tweak to the wording to reflect the existing process of using the actual income received as the denominator for the calculation rather than income at budget setting. So that's just the existing practice, but the wording in the scheme didn't quite reflect that previously. So we've just updated that. And then other changes are around, sort of minor changes around dates, etc. And in terms of the balance control mechanism, in the usual way, the local authority will revert to forum in June to make a decision about whether we implement the mechanism. So the mechanism is in the scheme, but the decision about whether to apply it each year is an annual decision for forum in the June meeting. So is there any questions around the scheme?
Does that change in the basis of using actual rather than budget? Would it change anything significantly? I assume it's rather in the noise and the technicality.
Yeah, so it's what's been happening anyway. So it's what we've been doing. So it doesn't change anything from what was happening. Effectively, over the last few years, schools' actual income has tended to be higher than the income at budget setting because there have been a whole raft of additional grants for pay and pension and whatever else they've called them over the last few years. So actually using the higher actual income is fairer and would be better for schools with a surplus, because obviously it would be a larger proportion of a, am I wording right, of a smaller actual, if you do it over actual, it's a large proportion. So it's the way we've been doing it anyway. But yeah, we discussed whether that should be the way it's done, and reflected that actually with these additional grants that are coming in, it's because otherwise schools are being effectively penalised for the fact there is additional income coming in later that they weren't aware of at budget setting, if particularly where they haven't had the opportunity to spend that, where some of that has come in quite late in the day, as some of those grants have over the recent years. So then the decision is around the approval of the scheme.
Do we approve the scheme for financing schools? Yes. Unanimous. Thank you.
Okay, so if we move on to recommendation 4. So recommendation 4 is around the early years block. So recommendation is just to note a short update on the rollout of the early years extended entitlements. So this is on page 15 of the report. Just a couple of points on this. So the extended early years entitlement take-up remains strong. And there's a figure for the number of active codes, 3635 currently. The early years providers have recently been invited to bid for capital funding in order to expand early years places. So this is a particular focus on the under 2 places, so less something that would impact schools, more something for PVIs and sort of nursery schools potentially. And so those applications have put that date is closed, and that panel were due to meet at the end of April. So I think that meeting has happened, but I don't have an update from it. But that intention was that funding was released to providers to create spaces for September, and using sufficiency data to support the decision making around that. And then, yeah, just there's been various work streams focused on early years and early help over the last 9 months, including earlier strengthening workshops, and over the course of the summer term, that work will be pulled together to ensure there's a clear direction and improvement plan. And some of that will be picked up in as part of the work streams we talk about later in the DSG management plan section. So yeah, any comments on that section? So the next recommendation then is to note an update on the work to maximise schools block and pupil premium funding to schools through identification and auto-enrolment of families entitled to free school meals. So the local authority have recently participated in a GLA-funded project to use benefit and income data to identify where there are children who are in Ealing schools who would be eligible to receive free school meals that are not currently registered. So that work identified 219 children from 182 families. And what's happened now is those families have been written out to, giving them the opportunity to opt out of an auto enrolment if they wanted to. And we will then, where we haven't had opt-outs, register those children for free school meals. So the total additional funding arising from that additional identification will work out in the region of £500,000 for schools across. I mean, those children are across almost all schools in the borough. So it's relatively small numbers at an individual school level, but that's additional pupil premium income and additional deprivation funding within the schools block, which would impact from the 26-27 financial year. So it's great that there's that's additional income. There's also obviously benefits for those families, both in terms of the actual meal for secondary children, and primary children are getting that anyway at the moment, but if that changes, and also in terms of other benefits such as the vouchers children get during the school holidays, access to holiday activity and food programmes, etc. But I think it's also important to note that that data matching exercise actually identified far fewer schools children missing out than have been identified in other local authorities. So some local authorities are identifying sort of 1,500 children. So in a way you think, oh, that's less extra money coming in, but actually what that does show is that the work that Ealing schools and the LA have done to identify families, so through encouraging families to apply, through sort of the bulk uploads and applications, etc., has actually led to the vast majority of eligible families already getting those benefits. The school's already getting the funding that they're due. So it's great that there's some additional children identified, but I think it's important to note that actually there's we're in a sort of good place already in terms of. Yep, so that additional funding comes through. So Ian's just asked about, do we get additional funding through for that for colleagues online? So that additional funding would then come through in 26-27 through the pupil premium and through the schools block funding for those children.
Can I ask, is this a project we anticipate continuing, or is it a one-off time-limited intervention?
So the GLA funded project, there's a company called Policy and Practice who led that, who were doing it as a one-off exercise, but the intention is to look at how we can then do that on an annual basis to try and pick up those missed families. So you'd anticipate picking up less missed families year on year, but I think it's important to try and continue that. There's also work being looked at nationally, so that it's been sort of debated in Parliament. They're looking at it in terms of what could be done nationally in terms of auto enrolment to, because obviously all of the benefit data at a national level, like it should be possible to do something nationally in terms of identifying and registering children, but at the moment it's being debated as to, so there may be some movement on that moving forward. But yes, the intention is to continue with something similar.
Sorry, Kim, are you saying that if it is decided to go forward with that, would you still do it on a smaller scale, or would you roll it out across Ealing?
So what do you mean if there was a national decision?
No, as in if you're going to continue kind of looking at doing this year on year, are you going to just be doing that for small scales like you've done this time with the GLA, or are you going to kind of expand it?
So that's a borough-wide thing. So that's that was looking at the benefit data, looking at the school census data from, and then identifying of those children that weren't flagged in school census being eligible, how many of them met the criteria through the benefit and income data. So it was a borough-wide project. I need to try to identify. Okay, any other comments or questions on that? Nothing from online? No? Okay. So the next section of the remainder of the report relates to the high needs block. So it's the right bit. So the first recommendation here is around noting and commenting on an update on the Ealing Additional and Special Educational Needs Disabilities Inclusion Strategy and the DSG Management Plan. So the body of this is set out in Appendix 2, which, if I get my pages right, is on starts on page 63 of the report. So there's a presentation included as Appendix 2, which provides a detailed update on this. So I'm going to hand over to Aretha in a minute to go through some of the main points from that. But I just think for it is, it's key to note that the decisions around the high needs block spend are decisions for the council, and the work to mitigate the spend is held within the additional needs and SEND strategy. So the engagement with schools will continue through existing working groups, such as the School Place Planning and Organisation Working Group, SEND and Inclusion Boards, through ELP, etc. But we will sort of continue to provide updates to Forum, and obviously there has potential implications for future decision making around the transfer from the schools book to the high needs book, etc. But yeah, I'll hand over to Aretha and probably step in at various points as well.
Thanks, Kim. I'm just going to go straight to page 65. So I'm going to talk to the pages in the report. Give you a minute to get to that page. So essentially what we're looking at is the context of Ealing as of Jan 2025. So we've got EHCPs increased by 9% between Jan 24 and Jan 25, and we're now above 4,000 plans, and that's across all phases. And that represents a 51% increase over the last 5 years, and that trend is not slowing or plateauing or decreasing. So we expect to continue to see a trend in plans. The prevalence of EHCP plans have increased by 4% overall, and 6.4 in primary, 5.7 of secondary age children now have a plan. 41% of Ealing schools with an EHCP attend mainstream schools. A further 8% attend SRPs or resource provisions attached to mainstream schools. 27% attend state-funded special schools, and 7% are currently in non-maintained independent schools or special schools. And 8% were in further education. So that's the breakdown. I'm going to go to page 67. So just noting some of the outcomes that we've benchmarked against in preparation for a recent peer review, but also in preparation to evaluate our current strategy. So we have some strengths that we would like to point out, and that is around the local strategic partners being firmly aligned and in collaboration and actively promoting multi-agency and multidisciplinary work. Senior managers all providing clear leadership at various levels to make sure that the additional needs SEND and inclusion strategy is implemented in full by 2027. Really strong collaboration and partnership across Ealing Learning Partnership. Constantly developing relationships with Ealing Parent Carer Forums and other parenting groups to ensure that we've got a more diverse and holistic representation and feedback mechanism for our parents and families. We have a very ambitious place planning strategy, which has seen a rollout of a number of expansions to our resource provisions, places in our special schools, and that continues to develop and grow over time. We know that our children in early years are well supported, although we do recognise there's much more to do about making sure that that network is cohesive and comprehensive and has a clear strategy underpinning it. And we have a clear plan for workforce development and recruitment. A lot of that sits within ELP, but we are doing more outside of that, particularly looking at apprenticeships for TAs and apprenticeships for children and young people who have special educational needs and disabilities. On page 68, you will see the specialist school place creation model that's from 2014 to 2025, 2025. I won't be here in 2055. So 667 additional places in special schools and resource provision in mainstream delivered between 2014 and 2024, an additional 67 places to be delivered in September 2025. So that just indicates the speed, the pace and the commitment around our place planning and our special place creation in the borough. This has doubled the number of state-funded specialist places in Ealing. I'm going to skip to page 70. And this really outlines where we are with the DSG and high needs block. So you can see there's a table on the sheet which outlines the in-year over and under spend, use of reserves and the closing spend. So at the end of 2023-24, Ealing's overall deficit from the DSG was 1.8+ million, with a 2.227 million deficit on the high needs block after the use of reserves and small surpluses on other three blocks. Ealing does remain in a stronger position than many other local authorities, and that's due to tight management and controls already put in place around this area of work. So whilst other local authorities may have seen a huge pressure and may have been kind of blindsided by what's coming down the track, I think the diligence and the expertise in Ealing has protected us from that somewhat and made sure that we've got a real tight grip and actually we know where the spend and the pressure is, and we know where the forecasting and the pressures will be in the next few years, and that can only be down to, you know, just really diligent monitoring and foresight on part of the planning and resource team. So thank them for that. It's put me in a really strong position.
Yeah, if I just sort of, I mean, obviously that's also an awful lot of work with schools, particularly around the place creation. So this saw on the previous slide the number of places that has been, especially places that have been expanded in Ealing, so that's kept our NMI, so non-maintained independent schools, spend a lot lower than a lot of other boroughs are in, and obviously there are boroughs that are already with many millions of pounds worth of deficits on their block. We haven't been in that position. We did move into an overall deficit last year, so just under 2 million. We're not quite, the final position is not quite finalised for this year, but it's indicating that would have increased to around 5 million by the end of this year. And then you'll see on the subsequent slides the forecast for where that goes. So that will come. Yeah, I mean, I can cover that bit now. So effectively, if we continue, if the current trends continue in terms of the number of children with plans, the proportion of children with plans, and the current pattern of children in specialist provision, etc., then our current position is just over 4,000. So if that trend continued, we'd reach over 5,500 by 2031. So there's that kind of increasing in plans increasing at pace. So that's an average year-on-year growth of 6%, a further 39% over the 6-year period. And that's even with the kind of context of the overall population in primary and secondary reducing. If you look on page 73, effectively what that would do, if we're assuming that the increases in the high needs block remain at a sort of relatively low level, so the forecast set in 2% for inflation, 2% increase in the high needs block, effectively that high needs deficit is going to increase exponentially. And this is where other boroughs have already kind of heading towards that area. So yeah, if you run those figures through to 2031, you get to a cumulative DSG deficit of over 300 million. So scary figures. Yeah.
So on the basis of that growth, are we going to become more reliant on NMI on the basis that we're not investing, particularly at the top end? You know, it was one of the questions I had on the sort of 20 plus, where we've actually predicting declining numbers. Is that because we're not providing places for people, or do we genuinely think that they do no longer need to be supported? That's on page 71.
Yeah, so at the 20 to 25 age group, those are, I say, the model is a kind of trend-based model, and so we haven't seen an increasing trend. It's actually been relatively stable at some ups and downs, but it's been relatively stable at the 20 to 25 age group, even as the kind of larger cohorts have moved through. But yes, potentially you could see more growth in that. I mean, it's only one kind of model of what could happen based on a trend model. Yes, without the creation of significant numbers of additional specialist places, we would expect, and that's what the unmitigated forecast shows, the proportion in NMI to increase rapidly.
NMI costs about double the maintain sector, so it's huge. Indeed, I was being generous. But can we actually afford to make the investment we need to make in order to save ourselves down the line 5 years, 10 years from now? Because it's a difficult one.
Yeah, so I'll hand back over to Aretha to talk through that.
Yes, hands back at a difficult one. So yeah, I mean, we have to do something, and as you quite rightly say, NMI is a high cost, low capacity model, and if we're over reliant on that, then we can, you know, add another million to that, maybe, or 10 million to that, depending on how many. I think when you look at NMIs, you're looking at the cost, but you're also looking at the transport, and when you combine those two things, we're talking quite big sums. And so what we have to do is look at a model that reduces our over-reliance on those NMI places. Yes, it does. In order to keep that money in-house and kind of purpose it or address the deficit that we've currently got. So I'll just go through some of the management bits, and then if there's any further questions on that, I can take those. So the management plan really focuses on a few key areas. One is that managing of demand, which is really key to this. Schools will play a huge part in this process, particularly around the early identification, early assessment and early intervention model. We are really looking at focusing a lot of resource going into that area of work in order to get to grips with the escalation that we have noted today, but we know is coming down the track. The kind of ethos behind that is the earlier you can get in to support children and families, particularly early years, and identifying the need early on, actually you might be able to mitigate some of the escalation that occurs through non-intervention. So that's what our ethos is at the moment, and we've got a clear early identification framework. Part of that is the revising of the ordinary available provision, which was done this year and is almost ready to be signed off. So there will be clearer guidance for schools at that very low kind of intervention tier around high quality teaching and mitigations that can be put in place there. And then we are also working on mapping alongside the OAP, the provision that sits alongside that for education, but also for health, so that schools can be clear about the wraparound services that they can access and the pathways to access those services going through. And we are working with health specifically on new contracts around actually what we need for speech and language, what we need for OT, and what that model should look like to enable that support to happen. The current contracts don't quite do that, so we're in negotiations there at the moment. So a recovery plan hinges on, as I said, early intervention, early identification and assessment, and that means we need to manage the appropriate numbers of EHCPs coming through, and the only way to really do that, unless someone's got some additional research I want to throw my way, that'd be quite handy, but it is around the early identification, early support and getting in at the earliest point, but also the rigour in our annual review process and the rigour in making sure those checks and balances take effect over the course of the time the child or the young person has the EHCP. So it's not a blanket EHCP for the 0 to 25. Actually, there are meaningful and purposeful reviews at each stage. And if something's not working, then we review that with the school and provide the right resource going forwards. So this work would include cross-area partnership work, as I've mentioned before, particularly with health and social care, to create a more holistic wraparound service that provides the support at the earliest point. So lots of support going in at the point of that EHCP that is issued, and then that monitoring over time. And in the mitigated forecast, the number of EHCP plans is projected to increase to 4,282 in Jan 2026. However, probably looking at the figures, we're looking at a bit more than that now. But we hope that with that intervention, it will gradually reduce back to that 4,000 marker, so slightly lower than we are now. We haven't put in, this plan isn't about culling EHCPs and stopping EHCPs and preventing that flow going through. We were very mindful of that when we did this plan. It is about trying to hold the percentage and proportion in the hope that actually that early intervention work starts to embed, and we can see those people who, and the children and young people who actually need the plans, getting the plans at the earliest point. And within that will be some discussion about mechanisms of support that happen before schools need to apply for a plan. Second point on our recovery plan relates to place planning and making sure that we reduce the reliance on NMIs by implementing a clear sufficiency plan that increases the number of places in mainstream schools, resource provisions and special schools by up to 500 places. And that's already in train, so work is already happening to achieve that. So this is not a new plan, this is not ramping up of anything, this is actually just following through the plan that we already have in place. So to aid the implementation of this, again, we're looking at early identification, support for schools that are opening the SRPs again, which is already in place, a clearer outreach model, and some workforce and development training to enable some of those resource provisions to ramp up in pace and be quite impactful. Recovery point 3, I've covered already in terms of the early identification and support. And this really relies on more analysis of our quantitative and qualitative data to make sure that actually what we're doing is the right thing for schools, but also for our children and families, to make sure that the early identification and intervention planning is meaningful and impactful at the end point, which is our children, and making sure that they feel well prepared for the next stages of their adulthood or their journey or their transition points. We also recognise, again, in this kind of area, the need for workforce development and support for schools to recruit, retain and keep those skills growing in-house. And so part of that early intervention plan is working alongside ELP to make that a reality, and to put the funds and the resources in the right places. We also recognise some bits, particularly around early years transition into primary schools and that element of school readiness. And I know that Helen has worked on her early help strategy, and that is a core part of that. And what we will do is align those strategies together to make sure that the work is complementing each other and the plans complement each other at points of rollout. And then we have our high quality commissioning and quality assurance. So this relates not only to NMIs, but to anything that we commission in this space, and just making sure that our performance indicators are really robust. We challenge uplifts where we can to make sure that costs don't increase year on year exponentially, but also making sure that our contract and our rigorous quality assurance is timely and meaningful, and that the places that we commission adhere to the expectations that we set out in our contracts. That hasn't been the case to date, but we've done a lot of work in making sure that those contracts align, and that work continues with the help of the commissioning team. You all know that we're working on level descriptors, and that is about creating a more transparent and fair funding model linked to EHCPs to reduce variation of funding across the system. And that is, again, already in train. We know that we have the level descriptors for SRPs and special schools. We are currently working on mainstream level descriptors, and that should roll out quite soon. So please do link in with any of those work streams. I did say that I would provide an update, so I will do that after the next meeting, which is on Tuesday. We also know that there are issues around early years and identification and support, and so we are going to be doing a scoping model around early years provision in its entirety, and that will run alongside health scoping model and social care scoping model, particularly on the early help strategy, and particularly around things like the ICANN provision and moving to more impactful different models of provision that's not locality based but more kind of fluid and agile. Should I pause there for questions or should I carry on, Chair?
Yeah, sorry.
Maybe if I just pick up around what that effect would, so based on the plan in terms of the mitigated forecast, what that then potentially looks like in terms of pupil numbers and the money side. So as Aretha said, the plan sets out that plans, the number of plans would continue to increase this year, but then begin to level off and come back down to, well, around the current level. That's the fact in terms of prevalence. That's assuming that the prevalence in primary and secondary begins to level off, and the overall population reduction then, if that impact on the overall population then has the impact of, with the reducing overall population, has the impact of then bringing that back down. Again, obviously that relies on everything Aretha's kind of just described. In terms of the potential impact on the deficit, so taking all of those things in place, bringing the plans down to that level, and the level of place creation that's described in the plan. So 8 additional SRPs in total, I think, are factored in within it. Increases in existing SRPs, additional places in special schools, including through satellite provision. With all of that, effectively, it like the deficit still increases based on a 2% increase in terms of, so we'd still be in a position of around 50 million deficit by 2031. So you can kind of see the scale of the challenge. I mean, it may be, you never know, get more government funding for high needs through that. There may be other national changes that impact that. So this sort of based on the numbers set out in the plan, but I think like this is not a plan that gets us to a 300 million pound surplus position. This is a plan that contains the spend to a, like, well, doesn't even quite manage to contain the spend within the high needs block allocation. So it's a significant challenge. I think Tamara just wanted to come in on some of the capital side, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah, so Ian, you asked a question about how we're going to fund it, and Aretha talked about kind of investment in outreach and early intervention from the revenue perspective. So a significant proportion of the recovery plan relies on the delivery of a significant number of places, and that in turn relies on the capacity and appetite of school leaders in Ealing to expand and create new provision. And historically, we've had quite a lot of success around that, and we'd need that to continue. There are a number of projects in the pipeline to get to up to 500 places. That relies on us repurposing existing accommodation primarily rather than building new. And there is some funding around that, but there's a funding gap. So some of this relies on future grant allocations and various other funding routes coming on stream. And those are kind of unknown items. So we've made an assumption around that at this stage in the plan. Hopefully that answers that side of things.
One other question on the mitigated versus unmitigated. Obviously, they all are heading downwards if they're mitigated, except, sorry, it's on the area I picked up, the 20 to 25s, which seem to be higher in the mitigated version. Is there a reason for why the mitigated should increase in the later years where every other age group goes down? Sorry, I'm just playing with the numbers here. I just spotted it.
Yeah, so I think it's related really. It's just to do with the modelling that's in there. So as I say, the model in the unmitigated is a trend-based model. In the mitigate, so it's just sort of applying that trend-based model through. In the unmitigated model, we've had a look at those kind of proportions and what looking at the mitigations we think is likely to to happen. So I don't think they are they higher? I don't think they're similar, aren't they, in the 2025?
They're 143, 143 in the last 2 years, and they're 168 and 174 in the mitigate. We just felt a bit odd.
Yeah, so
Effectively,
effectively what you've got in the unmitigated model is a trend, and for 2020 to 24, that trend, because of what's happened over recent years, is actually reducing at a faster rate than it is when we look at the mitigated model. So it's kind of a modelling issue, really. There's nothing like in terms of what actually is going to happen to 20 to 25 for us, and there's more work to do around that area to understand the children coming through and the actual proportion of children in that age group we would expect to see having a plan moving forward.
It's probably a question for Aretha. Page 82, I can see it says that we're intending for the review to also support parents and carers to navigate the provision. I just wondered what sort of communication or support there might be given to parents to avoid them requesting EHCPs, because in our experience at secondary, actually, it isn't so much the school who are trying to go down the road. It usually the requests often come from the parents, and it's quite difficult to refuse. And I would imagine you also get into territory of legal challenge and discrimination if you start to say, well, we're just not doing it. So how's that been thought about? Because also if there is, even if you put somebody forward for an assessment, there's still a cost to that, isn't there, even if it's not granted. So it's just about all of that side of it, really.
Thanks, Mia. You're absolutely right. It doesn't matter if as soon as you got that request, you've got to act on it, and there's a cost attached to that when it goes through the various stages for a plan, even if it doesn't end up in a plan at the end. And so what we've done is we've held a parent partnership review that happened in October, finished in January, and there were some key recommendations around that review. Some of it was around connecting the parents together. So we've got various parenting groups in Ealing, but actually they're not very well connected, and it's about making sure that actually we build a system that connects them together in order to get some of that messaging out there, so that you don't have the kind of disparity in messaging from different groups. You've got a consistent message going out there, and so that work will happen over the next 18 months or so. But also there is a refresh of the local offer. There is something around the clarity of the realism of actually having a plan and what it actually provides versus what schools already provide really well, and showcasing and signposting back to kind of going back to the school as the first point of contact and having that real discussion about actually what happens at send support, just to demystify some of the misconceptions that might align and lead to those applications. So there is a bit of work going on there, but yeah, we fully appreciate that we need to support parents as well. And also make sure that they've got the right information at the right time, so it's not overly reliant on coming into the system to get the information. Actually, we should be providing it in a more proactive way.
Thank you.
Any other questions at all? Comment on strategy?
Can I finish up?
Yeah. Sorry, Jamie.
Just a really quick one. I think we're at risk of straying into what the other committees are doing. I really appreciate it. I think it's all great, but actually we should just be doing the school forum side of it. So I think we're maybe asking slightly too technical questions. But what I was going to say is I said this in the pre-meeting, but I think it's really, really important that all stakeholders get involved, like all head teachers have chances to hear this at heads briefings and other things, because I think this is a really important message and we all need to be on side to make it work. But that's not our remit now in Schools Forum, but I know I said that to Aretha already, but I think it's a really great piece of work, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Aretha.
And thank you to Kim for doing all the figures.
Yeah, I think, before you finish off, Aretha, I think one of the things that has come very clearly through the discussion this evening is the incredible partnership working that's happening, not only within the local authority, but local authority to schools with each other. I think it's truly remarkable. And I know I've been on this committee for a number of years, and I've blathered on every single year about send strategy, send strategy, send strategy, and for a number of reasons that are really understandable. You know, there's been turnover in roles, there's been, you know, that sort of thing. But I think, you know, like the plan, lump the plan is slightly irrelevant at present. I think that the fact that there is a really clear strategy that's been thought through, that's been consulted on, and will continue to be consulted on, is an absolutely incredible thing. And I can't speak on behalf of all members because I haven't consulted with them, but I can absolutely speak on behalf of my school and schools in Southall that have been speaking with us for a long time. This is incredible work, and you know, we're really, really looking forward to it continuing. So thank you, and thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I mean, I'm kind of new and I don't understand the numbers very well, but I was thinking, so I mean, I suppose schools are being encouraged not to reduce the number of EHCP plans, but think about it, you're going to put all sorts of strategies in, so hopefully the demands will go down. But I think a lot of people, the question is, because the need is increasing, maybe not for a plan, but to be able to manage at the 10K level, will the school get more funding, like the just the below top up funding, to be able to manage that in school without applying for another, the EHCP?
So I'm going to hand over to Kim, but I think the intention is to work with schools to come up with what that might look like. There's a little point in me kind of going, this is what I'm going to do. But just making sure that schools are front and centre of the planning around what that early identification and support looks like, but also what the other bits of resource might look like around there, because we do recognise that the need is getting more complex, the need is rising, and like you quite rightly say, it's at 10K actually. If we really dig into that data, those are the children that we're really concerned about, because actually they don't have a plan, so they don't have that wraparound support following them through the journey, and that's the bit that we need to kind of get to grips with, stop the escalation, and then try to support schools to better manage that cohort. You're already doing fantastic work, so this is about building on that and recognising that and developing that with you. And so this is our plan. This is the Ealing strategy, but it's our plan. We have to work as a collective to achieve this. And so when we do those engagement events and when we do start to move to the next phase, which will be the rewrite of the next strategy, one of the things that I'll be doing is asking for school reps to be front and centre and really involved in that. So the strategy from 2027 recognises and represents where we're aiming and where we're moving to as a unit.
Yeah, so I was just going to add that, so they're as part of the mainstream level descriptors project, and looking at a new funding model for primary schools, one of the things we're looking at is early support funding. So within the high needs block, not all of the funding needs to be diverted to children with plans. You can put in early support funding where schools can actually apply for funding for children who don't have a plan. So at the moment, what we have in Ealing is a model for short-term exceptional funding, which is only for kind of schools in deficit, but it's quite a small number of schools and a small amount of funding for that. So one of the things we're working with the mainstream working group is around actually, do schools want an early support funding model? What would that look like? It's all the same pot of funding, so there's not a magic pot of funding over here for early support funding. It's all the same pot of funding. But if that's something schools want within the funding model, then we can. The intention is to think about adding that to the funding model, and so there is a mechanism for schools to apply for that early support funding where it could support, and that's not necessarily for children like the step funding is that are sort of heading towards a plan anyway, but potentially for children who actually may not need a plan, if that early support funding can support them with that. Obviously, it's not all about the money, and the outreach is a huge part of the kind of support that schools will have. And within the plan, there is kind of additional investment in outreach built into the plan on a kind of investor save basis.
Thanks, Kim. I'm just mindful of time, and Jamie's points is absolutely correct. So I'm just going to move us back to Aretha to finish her presentation, and then.
Yeah, I'll just whiz through. So there's some key risks there that we've got mitigations against. It's not an exhaustive list, and I'm sure it will be a fluid list as things roll through. And then you've got some work around the priority work streams, so just the headlines in terms of what we have considered, where we're linking into other strategies and other plans, and what we're focusing on. So, for example, we've got stuff around the place planning, but we've also got early years provision in there, some consultancy support to really drive forward and support schools with the adaptions. When you've got complex needs coming through, actually some schools just get stuck on the implementation. They know they want to do something, but that realistic kind of element of how to do it is missing. And so we're putting some resource there to enable and support schools to deliver some differentiation and adaptation. And we've got things around the early help strategy and making sure that's aligned to the next iteration of the SEND strategy. And then just the last few slides highlight the peer review recommendations. We had a peer review in February, not recovered from it yet, but we're obviously due the big which is a 3-week review of our SEND strategy and implementation as an area partnership. So we've been very mindful of that kind of peer review and the line in the sand that says this is where you're at the moment, and some work is going on around making sure that those recommendations are taken through to completion, and that we have plans stacked against each one of those, particularly if we get the call. Touch wood.
Thank you very much, Aretha, for that really thorough update to the forum. As I said earlier, I think it's showing some incredible work between the council and schools and the work that your department has undertaken. So thank you so much. The last bit on the agenda, if I'm correct, Kim, is updates on top-up funding arrangements. Is that correct?
Yeah, so just before we get to that, there's a short recommendation which is around noting the update to Year 11 provision. So forum members will remember that we've spoke about this at previous meetings, and we've been reviewing the way that the unplaced Year 11s that arrive are currently provided for in the borough, because there's currently a fairly significant investment from the High Needs Book into alternative provision for that group of children, rather than them going into high schools. So from September 25, Year 11 placements, from the majority of Year placements will be managed through Fair Access Panel, with a much larger proportion of those children going into mainstream high schools, following a sort of fair share principle. The large college pathway that we've had will no longer be commissioned, although there will still be referrals for the West Thames College pathway for children. Was it Key Stage 4 English for speakers of other languages? The ESOL pathway for children with very low levels of English fluency, and or potentially those who arrive late in the year. And so the change is anticipated, so there will still be some spend on alternative provision from the High Needs Book through that, but it is anticipated to reduce the High Needs Book spend on Year 11 alternative provision by around 400,000 to 500,000. That's not to say that funding then just goes back into the ethos of the deficit. The intention is around actually that funding being part of the funding to better support all schools through kind of outreach and some of the other areas that Aretha's talked about, but to enable us to take forward some of those things, the spend on this needed to kind of reduce. So we're currently working with a group of high school heads, large group of high school heads and other representatives from high schools around the Fair Access Panel, what that needs to look like and what needs to change in the protocol to support that, and also some of the other issues around Fair Access Panel, and working through updating the protocol on that. So had a meeting yesterday and another meeting next week around that.
Thanks, Kim. I think it's worth noting that this has been a challenging conversation for everyone involved, the local authority and for schools, and that it is absolutely worth noting the appreciation of everybody involved being able to come to a consensus, as difficult as it is, because everybody wants what's best for the children, but that a consensus, we're getting there, and that's really great work on behalf of the high schools and the forum, the officers.
And then if we move on to the final recommendations, which are around noting an update to top-up funding arrangements. So we always in the April meeting bring an update on the top-up funding arrangements for the new financial year. So Aretha already touched on it, the level descriptor project. So this is page 16 of the report. The level descriptor project aims to deliver a more fair, consistent, transparent, effective funding system and a system of resource allocation. So we've talked previously around the special school and the resource provision level descriptor projects, which have been taken through to fruition and influenced the top-up funding from 23-24 for special schools and from 24-25 for resource provisions. So we've reviewed the top-up values allocated to each level descriptor for both the special schools and for the resource provisions this year, and increased those top-up values by a small amount, by around 1% on baseline and top-ups combined, to reflect pay and inflation pressures, so kind of in line with the increase that mainstream schools saw, with noting that special schools are still getting some of the funding that's been wrapped in for mainstream schools. That's still coming as a separate grant in 25-26 for special schools. So on table 17, it sets out the new top-up descriptor level set values and what that means for the special school top-ups. So the special school top-ups now reflect both the revised level descriptor top-up rates, but also the spread of needs across the special schools. So what the model does is look at the spread of descriptors in the January and provide an average top-up rate for the schools. So those revised rates and the contribution of those different factors is set out in table 2, which is on page 17 of the report. In total, it's an additional in the region of 1.8 million going into special schools this year from the high needs block. So around 2/3 of that results from funding additional places, with then cohort changes, another sort of 250,000 of that, and 1/3 allocated in response to the pay and inflation pressures. Page 18 sets out the resource provision. So we're in the second year of the new top-up funding model for resource provision. Again, there's been a similar 1% on baseline and top-ups increase on the specialist provision descriptors. So those are set out on table 3 on page 18. The model has a rate for the special resource provision descriptors, but then also it continues to have where pupils in those provisions are meeting a special school descriptor, a higher funding rate being assigned to reflect the resources to meet those needs within an upper SRP setting. Again, what we've done is taken the cohort at January and then applied those new rates. So in some of the schools, that has meant a decrease in the top-up value for 25-26, but what that's reflecting in those schools is that there were previously some children in those schools who were meeting the special school descriptors, so they were receiving a higher rate of funding for, and in some of those cases those children have moved on to other provisions. So it's reflecting the sort of revised position in terms of the average. So total additional funding going into specialist provisions is around 500,000, of which a proportion of that, a majority of that, is around additional places. The cohort changes is broadly nets off, and then the increase for the pay and inflation pressures. And then the alternative provision, the position there is we're effectively maintaining existing funding rates and working currently with Ealing alternative provision around the model, the SLA and the kind of funding model for them. So the rates have been maintained while that work continues. And then in mainstream, so again, Aretha touched on this, but so phase 3 of the descriptor project is initiated in summer 24 and is the mainstream part of the project. So there's a working group with sort of broad representation that are meeting monthly. The aims of that level descriptor are effectively the same project, same as the previous phases, so around refining and simplifying the current band, resolving some of the issues raised in the context of the overall high needs funding pressures, of course, and co-developing a fair and transparent basis for the SEN funding. And as I've mentioned, that will include looking at some of the other kind of elements that can sit within a funding model, including early support and high incidence funding, which are the other sort of elements that you can have within a mainstream funding model. So that group have been co-producing the levels of need and testing them against children and young people. So we're almost at the stage where there are those descriptors for mainstream kind of pinned down. And the work moving forward is around sort of moderating children against them and then working to a new funding model. So that's going to be a sort of phased implementation plan. So rolling out from kind of September 25 at the earliest, moving into next financial year. So the phasing is currently being sort of determined and inform the kind of timeline for that. And the existing top-up rates have been maintained while that work's completed. And just to mention that we're also, so it's now 2 years since we introduced the special school level descriptors. And so over the course, then what we committed to was reviewing after a 3-year period. So moving into the autumn term, we'll be working on a review of those level descriptors at special school and what's working and what's not working around those to inform any future changes on that.
So can I just ask a question about that? So I apologise if I've missed this in what you've said. So table 4, the top-up amounts of primary schools are quite a lot higher than secondary. Is that just because the needs of the children are higher at that stage? They've been identified as high as part of this calculation process.
Yeah, so all of the primary schools and secondary schools are. Oh, I'm feeding back. Me, turn yours off. Primary schools and secondary schools have so the rates for the different descriptors are the same for primary schools and secondary schools, but the mix of children in those provisions is quite different. So the secondary schools that we have at the moment are much more kind of traditional ARP models, so additional resource provision, whereas the primary schools have moved to what we're kind of calling a specialist resource provision, so have a far lower level of integration and a much higher level of needs.
Okay, so sorry, that was how I understood it.
Yeah.
So thank you for clarifying that. So my next question was, do you anticipate that then as those children move through to secondary, that funding model will stay the same and not decrease?
So part of in terms of the place planning strategy, part of what we're doing is developing specialist resource provisions at secondary. So the provisions we're developing at Arc Acton, which opens in September, at Northolt, which opens the following September, April, potentially, depending on the building work. At Villiers, and also the work we're doing with some of our existing provisions around the profile of need, are that actually those secondary provisions will have a much more similar profile of need moving forward than to the primary school provisions. So there's not an expectation that those funding rates would decrease as those children move into secondary. In terms of the overall funding that you receive, there are differences because secondary school funding levels per pupil are higher than, so the funding that you receive through the schools block per pupil is higher in secondary than in primary, but the actual top-up rates based on the descriptors, the intention would be that those would continue to align across the phases.
That's great, thank you. I was just checking there wasn't like a change in formula when they get to a certain age or something. Thank you.
Obviously, you talked about the funding models for primary not changing because of the level descriptors for mainstream EHCP children. I just kind of making a point there that obviously we've all got inflationary increases and stuff like that, and the vast majority of the funding that we get for our EHCP children is spent on a one-to-one member of staff, and it makes it hard for schools to budget not getting those increases. And I appreciate the waiting to have a model because otherwise you're doing double the work, but I just think there might need to be just an understanding that schools with large numbers of EHCPs are going to be are going to really struggle to support their staffing costs if the EHCP funding doesn't go up in line with inflation. And I don't know whether it normally does year on year or anything. I have no idea, but I just, it kind of jumps out that the others are being increased and mainstream EHCPs aren't yet.
Yeah, those rates haven't increased for some years. What we have seen over that period, the sort of last 5-10 years, is a much higher proportion of children being funded at the highest levels. So we've seen what's known as band creep. So actually, the change that we've seen doesn't reflect what you would expect to see in any kind of, just like, obviously we know there is an increased complexity of need, but it's a significant kind of shift in the proportion of children at the highest funding levels and not the kind of triangle that you'd expect to see in terms of need. So actually the amount of fund, so while those rates haven't increased, the amount of funding going into mainstream top-ups has increased significantly over that period and continues to do so. The level descriptor project is the mechanism for us to develop a model that does provide that fairness and equity, but also helps us to really understand the needs of the children in our schools and make sure that those children are being funded appropriately, because at the moment there isn't that equity between the children with the same needs being funded at different levels in different schools. So we're working kind of as quickly as we can to address that and get to a model that can actually be rolled out and provide that.
I'm a fan of the level descriptors model. It's just, noticing that there's no funding increase and, just questioning about whether there normally is year on year. But you've answered that really well, so thank you.
I wanted to ask, you say that overall it's 1% increase, I think, in all categories, but I'm thinking about special schools in particular. Is that also meant to cover the sort of pay costs because that's way obviously below the amount even of the pay cost, let alone all the other inflationary factors that schools are having to live with? I mean, national insurance costs alone are going to have kicked in. Are there going to be top-up grants again to try to cover some of those? Because it makes it quite difficult when it's fragmented, the way the funding comes through.
So in terms of special schools will continue to receive a core school budget grant this year, which includes the funding for the teacher pay and support staff pay awards for the last 2 years, and also an additional funding to cover the national insurance contribution increase. So that rate that special schools will receive through that core school budget grant is nearly £3,000 per pupil now. So it's quite a significant additional amount of funding on top of the top-up funding. In mainstream schools, most of that funding has now been rolled into the formula, but the national insurance contribution bit is an additional grant still, because that was announced later. So there is additional funding which is intended to largely cover the national insurance contribution. Obviously, whether it does or not depends on staffing levels and vacancy levels and various things, but it is intended to cover that. In terms of this year's pay awards, the government's current expectation is that those are met with an existing funding levels without any additional through efficiencies, and I'm not the government, but that's not their message, without any additional funding attached to it. At the moment, those so the original recommendation on the teacher pay award was 2.8%. The latest information is that it's potentially a 4%, and so that's with the government at the moment to make a decision over whether they accept that recommendation and make a decision as to whether there's any additional funding that comes with that if they do. So there could be, I guess it depends what decision the government make around that pay award and what the backlash is to any decision that they make. At the moment, then saying there isn't any additional funding and it's within existing pay awards, but they haven't yet obviously agreed to a 4% increase. The support staff pay award at the moment is a 3.2%, I think, is the recommendation around that. But again, yeah, it's a bit with the additional funding. There has been that additional funding in the last few years, but at the moment, that's not the message.
7.
think everybody would be aware we are we are about to conduct in June, moving from the indicative ballot to a formal postal ballot. The key area in which we will be balloting is funding, because everyone in this room knows that if we get a 4% and it's not unfunded, there are going to be redundancies, there's going to be more strikes. So the problem is the government and the lack of funding. Any help in helping us get over those anti-trade union thresholds will be greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you. Any further questions on the update?
One last promise.
Yeah.
On the mainstream that Jamie was referring to, and assuming that the descriptors are deployed and the assessment of every child is done on that basis, if the cost to a school or even the borough as a whole increases as a result of those being accurately now reflecting the requirements of each pupil, will the funding follow that? Because I think that would be another risk for, we've got a great plan. I mean, that the descriptors, in my view, don't always work perfectly, and we've had this discussion, but they are a step in the right direction, but they do need to be funded because it's moving from the way it works now to the way it's going to work at some point in the future. And I don't know how confident you are that could be funded if it needed to be.
So we can't plan as a local authority to set a deficit budget in the same way you guys can't. And so whatever the funding model looks like going forward, it needs to be broadly within the funding available. So to some extent, it's about distributing the funding fairly. What we have seen when we've rolled out the descriptors, both in special schools and resource provision, we did increase the overall level of funding going in. So there is likely to be an element of that. What will emerge through the descriptors work, though, is setting a clearer expectation around the broad range of resources to meet need. Quite often when we talk about funding, we think about it in teaching assistant hours, and that's not an affordable model both for schools or for the local authority. And so it will need to link into the wider work which Aretha's described around outreach, thinking about the provision map across a setting rather than thinking about the child in isolation. So clearly the child has a plan. The plan sets out resources to meet need, but that's in the context of a wider provision that has an offer in place. And so I think there's a really tricky balance that we're going to have to strike. We think that it will be a big step in the right direction, but I don't think you can expect there to be a really significant injection of funding that's going to resolve all of the issues. Some of those issues are still going to remain subsequent to completing this work.
Thank you. Thank you. Any further questions on the update before we move to close the meeting? No. Wonderful. Officers, do you have anything further you'd like to present on today? Okay, well, if we've learned one thing today, it is that Kim is not the government. And that's an important message for all of us. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time, your contributions. A brilliant meeting again, as usual. Thank you, officers, for your work in advance of the meeting. And thank you, everybody, for your support. The 30th of April meeting of the Schools Forum is finished. Thank you.